Okay, we've shown a few of these things that are written in the stars. It shows astrotheology had a lot to do with all kinds of people, and in fact, it seems to stem back from the ancient Sumerians and how incredible they were, and that a lot of people mooched off of their ancient society. Where there was also a mass migration out of there after a flood that they have that kind of sounds like a biblical tale too. It's kind of twisted into it with Abraham. We'll get into that here in a minute though. But here you can see this is the sign of Aries, and in Aries, in Sumer, was actually a man and a plow. Now, every time you see Aries, just like you see it here, which we're familiar with the depiction of, its neck is broken and it's turned back looking. This is because the way the dots all line up, but this also gives you the idea of a sacrificial lamb. So when we talk about Jesus is the Lamb of God, and they were certain of it because it was written in the stars, you can see this is where they get it from, and they were certain of it, just like the way that they say that Jesus was the same God as Yahweh is. It's because he uses the same constellations and is doing something over and over again, and the stories are echoes of each other in a way, sometimes due to the fact that they're using the same constellations and changing some of the names and things, but because of that, you can see it echoed again. Just kind of clear to see whenever you start to know or understand things like this. So in Sumer, this is the way it kind of came across more, where there's this star known as Ari, like Aryans, and there's a plow that's there. It's kind of really a triangle that's where there with a couple of other stars near to it, but out of that conflagration you still get that. But what does he plow? Well, this is actually Adam having to plow in the field of Pegasus that's over here, which actually should be up and right out of the screen, but it's still right there on that band that we always, well, have currently been looking at. And we're honestly looking at just a spot that's pretty much 1/4 of the zodiac, and you can hold your hand in front of your face and cover it up at nighttime and still have everything else visible. So we've talked about how Aries, which is missing from this diagram, should be right over here, really right below this serpent pretty much that's there, and there's that one dragon that's there. There's the dragon that is Hydra, and then here's the sea serpent that's there. This is Yam and Leviathan, this is Tiamat, and so on also, that makes up those stories. And Tiamat and Bahamut, their disruption of each other makes the Milky Way and the band of stars that they talk about. But there's other things they talk about, like a belt of stars, and that's something different. That's the thing inside of Orion that's over here. And by conflagrating his name, you actually get somebody who is anointed and a chosen one and things like that. And therefore here all of a sudden you get Jesus walking on water, and there's the ship. That also is the Argo. Let's talk about something that goes along with that, because whenever you look at Orion, a lot of times you see him in different depictions, but the common one is him drawing back a bow. But here he's shown back and pointing actually to these giant mountains, and those are the mountains of Ararat where the ark ends up resting. And somewhere right over in here ends up being the square of Pegasus. So when they went up and they were sure that they went to the left side of it, in these mountains here, which is Gemini, and the ark ends up resting on top of the waters, this is where the story comes from. There's quite a few other things that are actually in this. It keeps pecking at me to start drifting off in left field about it. But let's talk about something that's a story that you might have heard before if you've read the tales of Hercules. You see, in the tale of Hercules, there's this king, and now Hercules has his 12 labors, and that goes through the zodiac. In fact, Leo is whenever he fights the Nemean lion and things like that. A lot of people are well aware of it. In fact, they kind of have shown that idea, and a lot of times whenever they show you some ancient Greek stuff, they'll actually have depiction in the stars. One famous one is whenever they show you the tail of Pegasus and stuff, and they wheel around showing it to you in this star chart form, showing you that it comes from the zodiac. And then, of course, you know the gods are the planets and everything else, so this should give you an idea of where everything comes from, but people don't make that connection, that anybody else could have been doing that. And due to the way paganism has been distraught or destroyed pretty much, and looked at as being filth or all kinds of bad connotations about it, it's been pretty much drifted off. And people write this off a lot because they've written on something so much more. Well, that actually entails a lot of the other tales here. That Orion guy that we're talking about there, on his arm also has a drapery of some stars that are right there clustered below his arm. And a little cluster of stars ends up becoming the Golden Fleece. So let's see, how does that fit into the story? Well, of course, that's Jason and the Argonauts, and that's the Argo down there at the bottom. And if you've watched any of the other videos, I show you how that name gets conflagrated, and it even becomes flood boat. And that's the big flood of the stars that's right there. That's the flood. It's written in the stars. Well, the Sumerians really had a flood, a mass flood, and they exited out of there, but we'll get to that here in a minute when we talk about Abraham and Bible connections again in the same type of story. But that Golden Fleece is something important. It's up there in Caucass, and the Caucass is in the Caucasus mountain area, you know, in between the Black Sea and so on, in that region. It's in there that keeps being so important. And of course, he's pointing at it right now whenever he talks about those mountains, and that's what that was supposed to signify. Sure, it's not exactly in the right spot, but it's right there, you know, in the sky. It's, you know, a couple of fingers widths apart or whatever. It's still right there in the story. It's written in the stars. It's in the picture. That's enough. It doesn't even really have to be. They can zigzag and grab things if they want to. So we look at this, and this King Amathus is in the tales of Hercules and his 12 labors, the zodiac. And Amathus has a son, a rightful son and heir, but he also has a concubine. And he ends up having a son with that concubine. And in doing so, the concubine becomes jealous and wants her son to become the heir apparent that's going to happen. And of course, this is echoed a few different places and actually happened in reality. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But so she was jealous and wanted her kid to be the one. So King Amathus is very superstitious, believing in all kinds of things. And if a priest told him something, he would just totally go for it. Could get him possibly believing anything. And in that fact, she got a priest in the story to tell him a false oracle that his son was going to grow up and kill him or do something, which is, of course, told over and over again and echoed in so many other stories. It's kind of typology, if you will, where here's this story attached to this, that, and the other. Did that ever happen? Did a son ever grow up and take his father out? Well, that naturally happened every single time, but did they kill their father to make that happen? Yeah, that happened a few times, and there was concubines that were involved in incidents like this too. So there's some reality in myth, if you will, instead of myth in reality, or both. But in this idea, he tells him a false oracle and tries to get his son killed, and he's about to sacrifice him. This ought to sound a little bit familiar coming through this point here, for whenever he's going to do it, Hercules comes out of the sky and tells him that Zeus doesn't like human sacrifice, and Phryxis is able to run off, and he finds, lo and behold, right there next to him somehow, which right here next to him would be Ares, which is a ram. And the Sumerian name actually can configurate that man into a ram. We've talked about that in another video in a real quick moment, but here we have that, and of course we talked about how Jesus becomes the ram, and everybody knows about that, and it has to do with the sign of Aries. Goes with the whole story incredibly, doesn't it? And then of course it's the end of Aries and Pisces, and here's Pisces over there. So we can see how things go over time with the zodiac and stuff. But whenever Phryxis sees this ram that's over there, he jumps on the ram and runs off in the other direction, turning his head. Ha ha. In the picture that we saw is always seen, and instead of being sacrificed at this point, he runs off on it just like Europa does on a bull, or other things that they talk about that were written in the stars. And he ends up in Caucass, which we know about Jason the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece. And it has to do with that. And of course the Colchians are supposed to have something to definitely do with the Egyptians, and you can see in the story here how it goes. But there was a mass migration, and out of Sumer into Egypt and into the Holy Lands and into Anatolia, a dispersal, if you will, that happened after their great flood, and symbolically calling themselves a brotherhood of a people that they were just in captivity with, writing a story about this. They hinged the Canaanites having had to do with the ancient Sumerians in some distant past, which I've shown in other Egyptian videos, how that makes connections. And there, the Gibel Iraq knife, and even in the Narmer pilot, there's all kinds of symbology that comes from Sumerians. In fact, the plugs that they make out of granite cores end up being over here carved into their cylinder seals. So both of them have that connection, and mastabas leading right into pyramids, which is something different. But over here we have a ziggurat, and it looks more like a South American pyramid, but it's the same concept, connotation, variation on a theme. You know, people try to talk about how much they're different, and they don't want to talk about how much they're alike. And wing sun discs and everything else. But let's get back into this concept here, because there are other people and other stories that go on here. In fact, if you've studied the Bible before or heard these stories, you've probably heard of the story of Abraham going to sacrifice Isaac. And whenever he's going to do so, he takes him up on a hill, which he's pointing at right here. And the kid wonders what the sacrifice is going to be. And he said, like, God will provide. He doesn't want to tell him that he's going to kill his kid. So this is a big test, right, on whether he's willing to go to the nth degree and kill their children, which happened before also, and somehow they want to put a reflection of that in the Bible. And of course, in an elder time like this, it's more understood of that having happened before and the horrors of things, and cut that shit out. In a modern day, we will not understand that, but in third world countries, they still have that concept. You can see it drifting back on how civilized people are and how that all works, and more in a modern day age versus something like that actually still goes on. There's primitives still in the world, believe it or not, that wonder what these giant metallic flying birds are that keep going over. They make a noise. But has this thing happened before? Well, Isaac, whenever he's going to be sacrificed, all of a sudden everything ends up being okay because a ram shows up. It's just an echoing of this Aries situation, but that ram is sacrificed. You can see its neck is broken. It's very easy to make that distinction out of it. And there's something very much in that guile that's there. Now, in this story here that we're talking about with Hercules, as opposed to the other one that we just talked about, there's a false oracle that gives him that, and Samson or some angel comes down and saves him and stops the situation that goes on. It's typology again. It's a copy concept, and here we go. In fact, here's the ram. In fact, at the end of the video, I'll try to find a picture of this ram that they found in Ur. and it's a ram caught in a thicket made from solid gold and lapis lazuli, and it's incredible looking. And it was found in Ur again, and that's the home of Abraham, and Abraham was from Ur. It says it cleanly in the Bible. And actually, if you pay attention to it, whenever he leaves Ur to come across and around the Fertile Crescent and come down through the Holy Land and into Egypt, which also shows you something that had happened before, and there was a mass migration after the point of the flood because their lands were devastated, and the Elamites took over in the Sumerian lands, and then the Akkadians and stuff like that, but we don't need to go there. But it says clearly that whenever they went that way, that he began to worship other gods. And the word there is plural again, too, so he's still not at the point of monotheism in any way, shape, or form, but he meets Melchizedek and plants a tree and does things that all have to do with Proto-Indo-European concepts and all this, and Christmas trees and ideas that I don't even want to go into all at this point, but it clearly says that he goes to worship other gods. Now, in that Bible, you look at it and look at what we have here, and the Sumerian gods were the gods of creation, and that's where they stole the creation story from. But now what are they stealing ideas from? Well, Canaanite and Egypt. We're over here now, stealing stuff from there. And then eventually Babylon becomes bad. Oh, it's the horror of Babylon, Babylon, Babylon. Used to be something great, then it went all sour. Well, look who took them over and stuff a few times. And of course they get this from the Babylonian captivity, but this concept of taking over and maybe even the second child, not the first, being selected, which gets echoed throughout the Bible a few times. You could say that it happens with Jacob and Essau, of course, and that's the woman that tries to get her favored son to take over, and they pull a trick on a blind man and try to get him to bred. And of course, Esau is known as a redhead, and the concept of hairy, they say here, but that would be either red hair, but then again, that same words are used whenever they talk about the rays of the sun sometimes, so it's supposed to have a connection on there, and the sun came first, let there be light, and then this happens and that happens. It's amazing how there's 2 or 3 little concepts all woven into each one, but there's an idea of that kind of going on, if you will. But to an extent, the idea of Herod killing the firstborn and all of that is kind of an echo, and here it goes again, you know. And Chronos, back in the day, gave up his only begotten son, Illiad, and they tell you that they tried to get others to pass on and do the same thing, and it ended up saving them all whenever something extremely drastic happened. And that's perhaps where the idea that the Canaanites were sacrificing kids and all that comes from and bleeds out of. But there's definitely that there. And there's another idea too. For this really happened at one time in Egypt. If you study Egyptian stuff, you probably know about an overthrow attempt with a concubine that was against one of the major pharaohs of Egypt, and she wanted her son to be king, and Pentuer and the whole group of them got caught and killed and not mummified correctly, and all these things about it too. But there's that little attempt of an overthrow, and it's just like the story there. So did they get that essence after coming down and around that idea? Were they well, they were well aware of everything that happened with each other, and it didn't take long for messages came on the wind. There are people going back and forth all the time. Whenever this went down, within 2 weeks, there was merchants that were in Egypt when it happened that had left, that are now in Sumer and coming down through there telling him that what happened. And sometimes it'll fly faster than a bird, won't it? So this is just one other little connection here, and you know, it's something that's a strange tale in the Bible, where all of a sudden God wants to test you enough, make you kill your kids. And of course nowadays, if they said, well, there's a God that does this type of thing, they'd be like, well, That's got to be a Satan. That's got to be something else that somebody would make do something like that. Well, we look at things that happened in ancient times. We look down on them, of course, because we're more advanced now and all these things that had gone on. But the Bible does encapsulate some things that happened at one time or another in stories woven into an idea. It's all written in the stars, too. It's incredible how much they were able to put together in all these stories. It's why when you read it, it gets a little haphazard, like you're listening to an album and the groups like the Beatles, so the songs are all kind of weird and different, but they can all kind of go together if you're looking at a different story and feeling in a different mood and seeing things in a different way. We'll move on to the next one here. Oh yeah, I was going to show you that picture of that ram in a thicket that they found in Ur. Take a look here. So here's that statuette. It's pretty good sized here. Ram caught in a thicket. There are a few different examples of this that they found, but there are two that are shown that are here, showing they had this connection. This was found by Woolley and his team excavating in Ur and dating way, way back in time, so something that they had before then, and this concept that goes on. You can see also over here to the right-hand side, there's one of those boxes that they ended up making that have the intricate inlay of ivory and lapis lazuli. But you can see this ram, or people say it might be a goat though, here in it, but female ram or ewe, or could be a goat or anything. But then these people actually had skins. In fact, that little box over there shows everybody on that box wearing all these skins that go off of this idea of a sheepskin. And then that sheepskin, that sacred sheepskin people ended up being over in Caucass. But then there's a connection where the Egyptians are said by Herodotus to be the same people as the Colchians. That it's not by this or that, but it's by their rituals and stuff. So they looked alike as each other, whatever, and they were just comparing Caucasians to Caucasians, of course. But in that fact, they make a connection there that both of them have a connection of remembrance. I think this is also that Abrahamic blend that coming over of ancient Sumerians whenever Akkad took over, and they were notorious for anybody they took over, they'd flip them over into a different land and move people around and stuff, and it's kind of a reflection of this happening right here. But look at this thing here and how pretty it is. Gorgeous pedestal box that it's on, and you can see why people say it might be a goat, but otherwise it might be a ram. It also has that little votive thing on its back that's right there. But that's the way they do sheepskins too. So is this a goat wearing a sheepskin? Is this a wolf in sheep's clothing or a goat? Peace.